Where can you even begin when attempting to summarize the 2023 Dutch Grand Prix weekend? It had everything, from interesting free practices, a thrilling qualification in wet and dry conditions, and even a race fans have been waiting a long time for. The wet-dry-wet pattern was effectively matched by how chaotic the race was, with rain arriving effectively at lights out and the reshuffling of the pack that came with it, followed by a period of relative calm, until all hell broke loose inside the final 10 laps, with the arrival of a much heavier shower than had been predicted. This gave the drivers the opportunity to start off the second part of the season in style. Some did, and some didn't. This was exactly the case for the Red Bull team. Verstappen went on where he left off, winning it all, and Perez failed to capitalize on the occasion again. This has led to more speculation about his future and his skills. Is Perez slowly degrading? Is he putting too much pressure on himself? And what does his future hold? His and other team bosses have opened up about his performance after the Dutch GP. According to rival Formula One team president Toto Wolff, the difference between Red Bull teammates Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez in Zandvoort and the overall chasm in their performances so far this season is difficult to fathom. While he did make it into the final qualifying part at the Dutch Grand Prix, he trailed Verstappen by 1.033 seconds and 1 second in the first two sectors, before finishing 1.313 seconds off in Q3. That was just good enough for 7th place on the grid, marking the 7th time in 8 F1 weekends that Perez did not qualify on the first 3 rows for Sunday's race. Mercedes chief Toto Wolff, who saw one of his drivers George Russell out-qualify Perez by 6/10, called Red Bull's current margin odd and bizarre. I mean, Checo's not an idiot, he said. We've seen in all these years, Checo is a Grand Prix winner, a multiple Grand Prix winner. And he was already a winner at Racing Point, so I cannot comprehend. I mean, we've seen Max has destroyed every single teammate that was with him, whether it's his ability to create a car around himself that is just very tricky to control, but fast if you can control it, and that makes those gaps. The 1.3 seconds, I haven't heard an obvious explanations, but odd. In his quest for an answer, Perez bemoaned a probably not ideal Q3 run plan in terms of the amount of planned push laps. Red Bull team principal Christian Horner told Perez was pushing himself to the limit. It's the same for everybody. You've just got to go out there and feel the grip and put a lap in, and for whatever reason, he hasn't quite had the confidence that, certainly Max has. I don't think anybody has had the confidence that Max has. So a harder session for him, Perez, but there's others around him that have struggled. I didn't expect Oscar Piastri, for example, to be behind him. Horner obviously didn't want to put too much pressure on Perez before the race, especially as the gap was so big. But nobody could have imagined that Verstappen would pull such a big gap on Saturday. Max Verstappen's unimaginable pole position during the Dutch Grand Prix qualifying even surprised Red Bull Motorsport advisor Helmut Marko. Verstappen's quickest lap was 0.537 seconds quicker than nearest rival Lando Norris, who displayed a frightening 1-lap speed for McLaren throughout the weekend. It's unimaginable here on this short circuit that Verstappen has a 6/10 lead, Marko said. We thought it'd be a 100th or a 10th of a second, but both the timing and approach were agreed between Max and his engineer. Just a warm-up lap, then set a timed lap. Another small change to the front wing here, but we left the tyre pressure as it was. In all situations, Verstappen just showed that he really had everything under control. Sergio Perez, on the other hand, was off the pace, which was because of a wrong approach according to Marko. There was intensive conversations with our simulation people. We had a large margin and everything was structured, said Marko. From Max's side, it was a clear decision to do a run right after one warm-up. With Checo, they drove a second warm-up lap and that wasn't the right decision. So, just a wrong approach, right? Not a big deal, you would think. But on Sunday, Perez couldn't impress the fans either. Although until Perez's shower trip at Tarzan shortly after the red flag, it was difficult to find fault with his Dutch GP performance. But it wasn't that exciting and not nearly good enough to challenge Verstappen. But a good second driver outing, you could say. Red Bull team boss Christian Horner even credited Perez with the inspired call to pit for Inters at the end of the first lap that propelled him into the lead. And while Verstappen closed in quickly, Red Bull's justification for the order in which the two were pitted was perplexing. Perez stayed close enough to his leading teammate thereafter for his drive to fall into the job done category. Until lap 63, that is. Alonso had second on a plate after Perez's mistake on Inters at turn 1, and he clipped the wall on his way into the pits. And while Perez was given a lifeline in terms of being reassigned to third after his stop reduced him to 6th when the red flag came out, that was negated by a pointless 5-second penalty for pit lane speeding. In the end, it was a matter of being so near yet so far. Because Max Verstappen won his third consecutive Dutch Grand Prix, and Alonso even was ahead on track when the race ended. This all happened while Sergio Perez had a legitimate advantage of roughly 15 seconds in the lead at one point. That's because Perez made the first of several risky tyre choices, coming in for intermediates at the end of the first lap, while others, notably Verstappen, stayed out on slicks as the rain shower developed. Verstappen wasted little time in diminishing that lead after passing Pierre Gasly's Alpine and Zhou Guanyu's Alfa Romeo, and he was within a few seconds of Perez by the time drivers switched over to slick tyres. However, Red Bull pitted Verstappen first for the slicks change, and by the time Perez changed one lap later after Verstappen, he had fallen behind his teammate. When Perez came back out in second, he seemed perplexed on team radio, asking, "Did Max undercut us?" So how did he feel after the race? Was Red Bull's justification for bringing the lead car in second unfair to Perez? Perez was not angry after the race, but he was shocked as to why Red Bull had positioned them in that sequence. "Well, I think in those scenarios, the team just have more information than we do at the time," he said. "It's something we obviously will review during the meeting, but I'm sure there's a reason behind it." He also attributed part of his significant time loss in the first inter-segment. He lost nearly 4 seconds to Verstappen on one lap, to the team telling me there was more rain coming. He went on to say that he would have probably kept the lead for longer if he had pushed harder during that time. After the race, Red Bull team leader Christian Horner stated that it was a simple decision. The way he, Verstappen, cut through the traffic was quite sensational, Horner said after the race when asked about the decision. Checo had the target to pull the gap on the cars behind him, but Max's pace as he came through the field was such that at one point he took 7 seconds out of him, over 3 laps, and was coming very fast. Then you get to that awkward point at the crossover, and Fernando Alonso and Pierre Gasly behind him had pulled the trigger after the switch to slicks. You could see from Albon on slicks that the circuit was coming alive for the slicks. So had we pitted Checo first, they would have both undercut Max, so we'd have gone from a net 1-2 to a net 1-4. So we pitted Max first with the risk that he'd undercut Checo, but we'd end up as a team first and second. It was a no-brainer. His outlap was so extreme, it took us slightly by surprise that Max jumped Checo. So just so much happening in very, very vulnerable conditions. After all, it wouldn't have mattered because at the end of the race, the Mexican was penalized for speeding in the pit lane after aquaplaning into the wall on entrance ahead of the late race red light. Ultimately, Sergio Perez's race was not as strong. He began from P7 and took the lead after an early pit stop in the rain, but he eventually plummeted from P2 to P6 due to a sequence of his own errors. He was lucky with his pit stop that gave him the lead. And then when he came into the pits, he crashed quite heavily into the wall and also got a 5-second penalty, Marco summed up. On the extreme wet tyres, he was too late on the brakes, and there he was lucky because the car was damaged, the front wing, and without the red flag, he wouldn't have finished the race. Marco wasn't too impressed. Christian Horner tried to save face and said he did his best but was unlucky at times. It all seems a bit too much as damage control. It begs the question, is there a future for Sergio Perez at Red Bull? Or are they lining up another driver for next year? After all, it's no big secret that Ricciardo was brought back to show his worth to Horner and Helmut. And another well-known secret is that Alexander Albon is in touch with 5 different teams for a racing seat, of which are some top teams, most notably Red Bull and Ferrari. So could we see one of these former Red Bull drivers return next year? What are your thoughts? Is Perez slowly declining? And would it be in Red Bull's best interest to get him out of the car in 2024? Let us know your thoughts and predictions for next year's lineup in the comments section down below.